Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're joining us from, and welcome to another edition of Spring Office Hours. I'm your host, Dan Vega. With me, as always, wait a minute, that's not Deshaun. With me today is my good friend, Greg Turnquist. How are you, Greg?
Great, glad to be here.
Just for updating everyone who doesn't know, Deshaun, who usually hosts this show with me, is in Barcelona for VMware Explore. So I enlisted my good friend Greg to host the show with me today. So we all appreciate Greg joining us, and we're going to talk about a whole bunch of different things. We're going to get into just some random topics, and then we'll get into something that's near and dear to Greg, which is Spring Data. So we'll get into that. So thanks everyone for joining us. We appreciate it. Good morning to you, Umet. We see we got a lot of people here so far. It's good to see. um, so Greg, how have you been? I haven't. We've done a couple live streams together this year, but I haven't talked to you in a while. I imagine you've been pretty busy lately.
Well, with all the run up to Spring Boot 3.0 hitting GA at the end of the month, I mean
Yep.
it's no time for slackers on the Spring team. So we have been hard to the nose at all
I,
kinds of stuff, and there's hot stuff coming with Spring Boot 3.
I mean, is there any like you guys are busy? Are there any new features coming?
Well, some of the big stuff is like some of the movements is Spring Boot 3.0 is going to have native support for Graal VM. I mean, it's kind of built into the bulk of the projects. That's one of the biggies that's coming with Spring Boot 2.7. That's where it kind of got started. There was an experimental module called Spring Native you had to add to the app, but in order to kind of bring some of that on board, but Spring Boot 3.0 brings that in house, so you don't need a side module to make that happen, and that's so you can compile your app into a native format. It's in exchange for your write once, run anywhere magic of the JVM. If instead you fit it to Graal VM, you can run it in sub-second time. And for
Yep.
those of you running 1,000 copies out in the cloud, I crunched the math like a few days ago, and I mean the cloud savings translate into hours to start up 1,000 copies. It's crazy.
Yeah, so I've said it a couple times on this show. I think people don't really, and I don't even to this degree. People don't understand the engineering feat that went into this from a Spring framework perspective, but the whole entire Spring ecosystem of projects had to fall in line on this. Can you talk about that just from like a Spring Data perspective, which is just one of the many projects in the ecosystem?
I can talk about it to a certain
Just a
degree,
high
but
level, yeah.
the main person on our Spring Data team that's run with the ball with that is Christoph Stobel, because he's
Nice.
done the bulk of the work for Spring Data. But fundamentally, there's this idea that when the app starts up, it needs all this metadata in order to compile the application. It's called ahead of time compilation. So
Mhm.
it needs to start up the app to look at what's there to kind of get a view of it, and then it captures as metadata. And if it can't code that it can't reach, or chunks of bits of blocks of code that it can't find, essentially get cut out of it. So
Yep.
doing certain things like reflection tricks or hacks or certain types of proxies, you'll overlook stuff unless you fit it or instrument it correctly to be picked up. Um, Spring Framework went into the app context code, which was, they used a lot of reflection sorcery when they first built that, and they've gone back and retuned that and tried to remove as much reflection calls as possible. And for the situations they do need it, you have to instrument it correctly for Graal VM. And so
Yep.
Christoph has worked on things like the proxies. Like people may not be aware, when you work with Hibernate, Hibernate has proxies to wrap the entities that you're dealing with. There's things like configuration classes. They would default into a proxy mode, but the whole boot team moved us towards, well, let's default to a non-proxy mode and only use that
Mhm.
if we need to.
Yep.
So if you're doing bean-to-bean calls and you're wrapping with things like transactional support, that's where a proxy call would help you out. But typically people don't use that in their daily applications all the time. So it's like, let's turn that on if we need it. Um, and there's other stuff. We have Spring Data REST as one of the projects managed by the Spring Data team. And that's where we take all the metadata from a Spring Data repository and combine it with sort of a programmatically defined set of Spring MVC endpoints to render hypermedia. So now you're getting into spring MVC magic and stuff like that. I say magic because it's really impressive. It's like there's actually talks about some of our teammates have made about how it's really not magic when you dig under it.
Yeah.
It's really some amazing engineering. But in Spring Data Rest, we needed to deal with how resolution is done to endpoints and stuff like that. So we had to run everything, run it in native mode, run it on Graal VM, check out that we're capturing everything, that we're not accidentally dropping critical things like that. And at the same time, we discover, well, there's this gap in Graal VM. There's an issue in the native compiler. And so our teammate, Sebastian DeLuise, has been kind of shepherding this whole movement. And so they've been opening up tickets, filing pull requests with Graal VM, taking feedback back to the Oracle team leading Graal VM. So it's been a lot of back and forth with the purveyors of Graal to make the whole thing work together in an effective manner.
Great. Just got a little comment here. Hello, guys. Graal VM support is the most valuable enhancements in the 3rd version. Incredible achievement. Virtual hug. Thank you so much. Appreciate that comment. Yeah, it's just amazing. And I know I've seen some comments internally on Slack from you as well. You know, we've both been giving Spring Boot 3.0 a ride, testing out some of the native stuff. So just really cool to see all that stuff like in a release version, in a release candidate. And wow, we're couple weeks away from an actual release, which is just mind blowing.
It is. It's really cool. But one of the other things that is cool to me, because the first 10 years or so of my career was spent in actually deploying software into a production system, is the fact that we have now micrometer support coming in with Spring Boot 3.
Yep.
Something like I know about 4 years ago, they had the idea that you'd have your Spring Boot application here, and there was a layer added on top called Spring Cloud Sleuth. It was sort of like let's layer on observability. Let's layer on the ability to trace calls through the system to measure not only like what are you doing when you do a web call, but how long does it take to do every step? Where's all your time sync going? This kind of production ready stuff. They kind of, I keep bumping into my mic. They pivoted from layering it on top to let's put it in down below to underneath. And micrometer, if you go to micrometer.io, you can find out more. It's sort of a facade for metrics and tracing, so that you can use one API to rule them all, and in the back end you can bridge it into whatever you want to use, whether that's Prometheus or Zipkin, or there's like a dozen others that I'm not totally familiar with. But and we've done stuff in Spring Data, for example. We added observability to MongoDB and Cassandra's, two of the key data stores. And one of the other, somebody else from another part of the team today, I worked on a proxy-based solution for data source. And what in the world does that mean? A JDBC data source, the interface that you use to hook into JDBC, he wrote a proxy wrapper around that. So if you just add this dependency to your app, it would wrap all the calls and hook them into Micrometer, so it could log everything.
That's awesome.
And a lot of people aren't aware of it, but you do relational database stuff, whether you're doing straight up JDBC, JPA, Juke, Query DSL, everything goes through JDBC to talk to a relational database in Atlanta Java. So this one piece of code hooks you in for all your relational data store needs to do tracing stuff with that.
Yeah, and we were talking before the show. I think the observability story in Spring Boot 3, Spring Framework 6 is one that I don't think is being talked about enough. And I think, hopefully that's part of my job is to make people aware of what's coming. We did a show on observability in Spring Boot 3 with Jonathan. So go back and take a look at the archives. And if you want to learn more about what's coming, take a look at that episode. But we are going to go through a couple things today with observability and Spring Data. So hopefully that will shed a little light on what's going on. Micrometer integration with Spring has very poor documentation. Is there an API documentation for micrometer capabilities that you'd recommend?
I can throw a comment onto that if you want me to. That is something the Spring team is very studious about, is getting out good reference documentation. So I can understand we may have set the bar very high on that, and so I think there's room to catch up. But we've actually been putting updates, for example, Spring Data MongoDB, then I talked about Spring Data Cassandra. We've actually added sections to the reference documents to talk about, here's the instrumentation that here's how to get the micrometer stuff activated properly in this kind of app. And these efforts are being done to the other reference documentation, but we're spreading our time out. We're having to both implement it and document it.
Yeah,
so
I
we
mean,
need to catch up on that front.
That is a good question, and I wonder if maybe Danish here and maybe myself, maybe we're looking in the wrong places. So maybe he's looking for like one specific section on just observability, like what are the changes in observability? Are you saying a lot of the documentation around that stuff is in the individual projects themselves?
Well, I think there's a combined effort. So you need to be able to you can go to micrometer.io to find a lot of information about how do I use micrometer to do something?
Right.
Because it's not one thing. I guess maybe I buzzed right past this is micrometer doesn't have any Spring dependencies. So if you can use micrometer and not be building a Spring app at all. That's part of what its design is for.
Right.
So there's an element of you need to understand here's how micrometer works and how to plug it in. So that needs to be documented. But then if you're now going to talk about it from what about I'm building a Spring Boot app? What does Spring Boot tell me about that? So I can understand there's room for let's get the docs polished up. Let's make them enhanced. Somebody who's happens to be using Spring Data MongoDB and is looking in that manual, we want to tell them here's some of the instrumentations that we're using on that. And so
cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. And I would just say if you go to micrometer.io, and actually if you go to the GitHub project as well, there's a bunch of samples on there. I know I've went through some of the samples with Jonathan. There's some Spring Boot 3 samples, Spring Boot 3 and database samples. So I'd go through those. That's, another great way to kind of find out how to use things. So I was looking at that. I'm looking for a replacement of Sleuth, so distributed tracing via Trace ID with W3C related changes. So yeah, I mean, I'd have to go look through the documentation to see if there's anything in there about the distributed tracing. If there isn't, again, I would check out the samples. So there are some Spring Boot 3 samples, and they probably have some distributed tracing on there. So I would check that out first if you can. If not, let us know, and I'll see if we can't come up with a nice example for that. Okay. So I think what we're going to do is we are going to go into kind of a little bit of a normal cadence around here. So if you are new to the show, I want to get into just talking about kind of what's new in the Spring community. We'll take a look at some releases, some news. And then all the while, please keep these questions coming. I see there are a lot of people here. We're excited to have you here. If you have some questions, please go ahead and ask those. We'll go through some news, and then we'll also go into a demo. We're going to talk more about observability, and Greg's prepared a little bit of a demo, and we'll talk through that as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if it sees that it's going to work. And here we go. Cool. So the first thing we need to talk about is Spring 1. So if you know this, if you know that we've been talking about Spring 1 on this show, I've been looking so forward to Spring 1. Spring 1 is no longer going to be an in-person conference in December. Sad to see the news this week that Spring 1 is not going to be in person. There is going to be a virtual event in January 24th through the 26th. You can go ahead and read the FAQ here on spring1.io. You can join us in January for free. So if you want to, you can go ahead and sign up for that now. The schedule is over there on spring1.io. Also, we are very lucky to be joined by Michael Manila, who is a senior director at VMware of Spring R&D, and he is in the chat with us on YouTube. So if you have questions about Spring 1 and the changes to the in-person conference and what's happening with the virtual event, please go ahead and ask those questions. And Michael has graced us with his time today. Thank you, Michael, for showing up. and he'll be happy to answer any questions. So go ahead and ask those questions. I'll get them on screen, and I'll get Michael's answers on screen as well. But as we'll kind of get to those as they come about. So I just wanted to get that out there about spring one. So that's it. Next up is the calendar. So we kind of like to start here with the calendar. If people don't know about it, calendar.spring.io. There's a nice view here of what is being released in the Spring ecosystem. So here we are on November 8th, which reminds me, if you didn't vote, please make sure you go out and vote. If you're here in the US, you can wait till this show's over. You don't have to leave right this second. As soon as this show's over, though, then you need to go out and vote. Please vote. Very important. So Tuesday, November 8th here, and we're looking at what's happening this week. We can see that aforementioned micrometer 1.1.0 or 1.10.0 yesterday was just released. We have some things going on with Reactor today, Spring integration, Spring Framework 6.0, release candidate 4 is happening tomorrow. Some changes, some Spring Security, Spring Session, and then Spring Boot 3.0, release candidate 2 is happening on Thursday. So we are getting higher and higher on these release candidates, which means we are getting closer and closer to GA. If you can look down here, we can see, oh boy, look at that. Spring Boot 3.0. There's no RC next to that. Just really exciting. Yeah, it's really exciting to see everything that has gone into all of these products. Not just Spring Boot and Spring Framework. There's just a whole suite of projects in the ecosystem that I'm really excited about. So a lot happening on that front. Anything you want to say about that, Greg?
Well, it is sizzling. There's some more stuff that's coming in this release is the adoption of Jakarta EE that we've seen for some of those of you that have been in the industry for a while. We once long ago had J2 EE, or the Java 2 Enterprise Edition, which got replaced with Java EE, but we've now the Enterprise Edition specs have been turned over to the Eclipse Foundation, and they've released Jakarta EE. And 8 was basically the first version that they built from the Eclipse Foundation. 9 is the one where they had to relinquish Java X as the base path of all their projects, because essentially Oracle holds the trademark on it. So Oracle said, we're going to keep the trademark, and you can come up with what you want to. So they reached into what was actually a very old umbrella from the Apache Software Foundation and found a trademark-free name called Jakarta Java, which nicely lets you keep the J prefix in all your favorite acronyms. So now JMS used to be Java Messaging Service. Now it's Jakarta Messaging Service. And Jakarta E9 is the one where they actually migrate all those prefix things from javax.whatever to Jakarta.whatever. And all the big projects are moving there. Apache Tomcat, Hibernate ORM, ActiveMQ, you name it. This is where the world is moving. And something that's actually coming in at the last second that we're having to contend with is the fact that Apache Tomcat 10.0 apparently reached end of life like right at the end of October, and we're skirting into November here.
Oh wow!
And so for Apache Tomcat 10.1 to pick that up, we actually need to pick up Jakarta EE10. So we're having to scooch over to EE10. There's not a lot of changes, if you will, between 9 and 10. So, but we're checking stuff out, making sure it works all right, because one thing that Spring has been very big on ever since day one was not breaking people massively, not making it easy to upgrade and move up to stuff.
Right. Yeah, and I think I've talked about this before. Like you said, there isn't a whole lot changing in the APIs there, but what's really exciting for me is that now that this has moved over to kind of the Apache Foundation, moving forward is we're actually going to see some evolution in these APIs. We're going to see changes. We're going to see additions. We're going to see some exciting new things. So in packages that have been, virtually stagnant for years, we're going to see some progress on. So getting us up to 10, that's great. If something new comes in 11, that should be something we're able to easily move to, as opposed to like this huge overall change. So excited to see that.
And well, something else we're also picking up is Java 17.
Yeah.
So Spring Boot 3.0 is going to move the baseline up to Java 17, and Java 17's got some cool stuff in it on top of performance improvements. So
Yeah, I was trying to put together a slide just to kind of show everyone who's moving from 8 to 17 what they're getting. And I couldn't even put everything on one slide. I have a friend who works at Oracle, and he had who runs the Java user group here in Cleveland with me, and he has one for moving from Java 11 to 17. And the features take up a whole slide, and they're tiny little text as it is. So just the things you're getting from moving from 11 to 17 are huge. The things that you're getting from moving from Java 8 to 17, on top of performance improvements, security and benefits, and all that stuff, there is just so many new features that we're going to hope the community starts to be able to take advantage of. So yeah, awesome. Uh, Oscar, hi everyone. Hi Dan and Greg. Hello from
fist bump.
Peru. Hello, Oscar. All right, so that's the calendar. Again, if you want to be caught up on some things, spring.io/blog is a great place to visit. Also, we have the Tanzu Developer Center. That is where you will find this show. There's also a whole bunch of free content on there. If you go over to learn under guides, there's a whole bunch of free guides on there. I just want to let you know that I published one last week. So if you haven't had a chance to check this out, serverless Spring, I put together a guide on basically how you can use Spring to write serverless functions. So if you want to, you can use something called Spring Cloud Function. You combine that with Spring Web, and you have this consistent programming model to be able to create functions and deploy them to whatever cloud you want. So in this particular instance, I ended up deploying something to AWS Lambda, but you could take the same code and then deploy it to Google Cloud or Azure if you wanted to. So cool little guide on that. If you're interested, go ahead and check that out at the Tanzu Developer Center. So what I wanted to talk about before we get into kind of talking about observability and Spring Data was just in the Spring Boot 3.0 release notes. If you go in there, you can kind of look at what's new. One of the things you'll see that, especially with this release, is you'll see a lot of dependency upgrades, right? So we have a lot of the major projects get these dependency upgrades. And then you can kind of see, hey, Spring Data is here, 2022, RC1. And so there's some release notes about that. So I figured since Greg was here, we would just talk a little bit about these because I've talked about some of these features before, but it's just nice to remind you that, you know, there are new features in a lot of the projects too. So while if you look at the release notes for Spring Boot 3, what's changed in Spring Data may not be in those release notes. Those are in these release notes. So if you use Spring Data, like most of us do, you want to go ahead and take a look at the release notes for each of the individual projects to see what's happening. So as Greg mentioned, general themes, upgraded Java 17, Jakarta EE10 there. You can see that is 10, not 9 anymore. And then I wanted to kind of talk about a couple of these. So the new CRUD repository interfaces that return list instead of iterable. So this is, you know, one of those little quirky things that we've always kind of had to deal with. If you create a Spring Data repository, you create an interface that extends something like CRUD repository, and you want to get a collection of things back. Like I want a collection of customers. That that interface basically defined a find all method that returned an iterable. And so that iterable then, like, I don't know, if you don't know the API that well, then you're like, what is an iterable? How do I work with that? I'm used to working with like a list of things. So new in Spring Data is the ability to extend the list CRUD repository. And all that does is add the ability to, it adds a couple methods in there that return a list instead of an iterable. So I thought that was pretty cool. There's the list CRUD repository, list query DSL predicate executor, and then the list query by example executor. Anything you want to say on those, Greg?
Yeah, that's some stuff that we've had a lot of back and forth with the community, and it's a topic that we've actually discussed over several years as to what to do. And for people that don't know, in Spring Data Land, we have sort of a common layer at the top where we define part of the behavior that every store needs to implement, and then you go down to a concrete. So we have like Spring Data JPA, Spring Data MongoDB, Spring Data Cassandra, and typically at the module specific level, we have things like you can have a JPA repository baseline, and so it's basically an interface, and you can actually go bake your own base interface to use everywhere, but we have ones already made for you, so you don't have to do that. So but at the commons layer, at the point that we wrote that interface, it's like we can't guarantee that every module will actually have a concrete list in hand when they get to that level. So it was like, iterable is the most abstract thing we can pick up and run with. So let's make it iterable, but on the data stores that know better, we can switch it to a list in their specific thing. But it turned out people were still having to go. The other thing you can do with Spring Data is you can extend the interface and then change the method signature. And Spring Data, when it actually derives the query, it will bend to your needs. So you can actually write an interface that's all stream based. You could return all stream, Java 8, java.util stream, whatever, if you wanted to do that, for example. But I think making everybody implement a list-based repository that's not specific to their data store, I think, became a little heavy-handed over time, and so we decided to extend that at the commons layer and offer a list-based one, and it's been accepted with open arms.
Yeah, I've been a huge fan of it. I'm just showing my screen here. I have just a quick example application that I'm working on for a tutorial on Spring Boot 3. You could see this post repository. I'm extending list CRUD repository instead of CRUD repository. Well, at the end of the day, it just defines a few methods here. So save all, find all by ID. But now you can see that it's returning a list instead of an iterable. But of course, this is now extending CRUD repository. So you're still getting all of those CRUD methods that you still need. Like if you need to be able to count or delete by ID, etc. Those are all still there. What this means now, though, is because list CRUD repository is extending CRUD repository, if we go back to the documentation here, we have these other interfaces, right? So the sorting repositories no longer extend the respective CRUD repository because now there's a list CRUD and a CRUD, and it's like which one, which one should they extend? They don't know. So at the end of the day, those are just no longer extending the CRUD repositories. So we have the paging and sorting repository. If you want to get that CRUD functionality now, Greg, do we just kind of extend that CRUD repository if we need to?
Yeah, if you're needing, and this is the thing, if you're needing that iterable version, then you need to go back to extending CRUD repository. And the other thing is, these are all basically some shortcuts because you can fundamentally go roll your own interface. You don't have to extend anything.
Right.
You would just need to, I think what you have to do is extend. We have a marker interface at the root of all of it that's just called repository, and there's nothing in that. So if whatever you do, if it just extends repository, you put in whatever you want. You can base it on list, iterable, stream, flux, mono. You can roll whatever you want, and there you have it. So we're just providing we're trying to hit what are some common shortcuts that's going to service the community in bulk, because we also get tickets opened all the time saying, could y'all create a stream CRUD repository? We're like, no, that's not as commonly needed. So we've turned that down, but you can go do it yourself.
You can do it yourself, right? Like to your point, if you tried to satisfy every ticket that came in, you'd have all these different CRUD repositories. So
we try to offer the best shortcuts, but at the same time, we try to offer escape hatches. So if you need something different, you can do it. Spring gives you the route to do that.
Yeah, and to your point, I don't know if people know this, but as you said here in this example, I have a post repository that just extends repository. There is nothing in here. So you're not getting any functionality out of the box. You essentially can create your own read-only repositories if you wanted to, right?
Exactly.
So like here, I have a method to just find all the repositories. You can't come in here and create a new post or delete a post. This is simply just a read-only repository at this point. So if you want that granular control over what's available, as Greg said, just extending that base repository is a really good option, and then you can kind of put your methods in here. And obviously, this all gets turned into the real deal at runtime, and everything just works. So,
and what's cool is you can also go into any of these methods that you're putting in here, whether you're extending one from a CRUD repository, whether you're making your own like Dan just did. You can also then apply Spring Security annotations. You can put pre-authorized annotations on those methods, and then you can decide what you're going to expose. You can sit there and put all the security rules you want on them, and Spring Data and Spring Security will take it from there and apply all the protections that you need.
Yep. Cool. I see a comment or a question in there from Mohammed on being an architect. We will get to that question. I want to get through some of the Spring Data stuff, and I will come back to that question. So to that point, in this example application, I'm using Spring Data JPA. You can see we're pulling in entity, and there's our new Jakarta packages. So you can see import jakarta.persistence.entity. So we are taking full advantage there of, hey, we're using the new Jakarta 10.
You're clearly not on snapshots. I can see that because you haven't gotten the latest.
No, I'm not. I am not on snapshots. So this is definitely this is probably RC1 that I'm on right here.
Yep.
Suddenly Jakarta, Washington.
I
cool.
drop with that. Okay.
So yeah, I wanted to mention that these list CRUD repositories and kind of what changes with paging and sorting stuff in case anybody wasn't aware. Revised constructor discovery for Java records. So yeah, that I don't want to get into. Pageable default sort of. Nope, don't want to talk about that. So Spring Data. Relational 3. I'm just trying to see what else I wanted to kind of cover here. Anything that you could think of that you want to kind of highlight here? I know we're going to talk about some of the observability stuff, so I don't want to talk about it here yet.
Well, and this is chock full of notes, and the thing is we try to curate this stuff because if you're interested in Neo4j, then you probably don't care about, for example, the MongoDB notes.
Right.
But if you're doing MongoDB, you're kind of like, I need those aggregation pipeline functions, which I don't even understand, but I let Christoph and Mark deal with that stuff. But some of the stuff that I like seeing, I've really enjoyed watching the evolution of Spring Data JDBC, Spring Data Relational, and Spring Data R2DBC. And that has been something that's been sort of in development for the past 4 or 5 years. I guess 5 years, because 4 years ago is when Jens presented it first at the Spring One conference at that point in time. But they started building Spring Data JDBC, and as a lighter weight, I don't want to say more effective. That's a lighter weight, simpler approach to doing Spring Data using directly JDBC and not JPA whatsoever. And then we got, at the same time, we were working on R2DBC, and then realized that rolling the SQL for both of those modules is kind of the same. So they extracted a common parent module out of that called Spring Data Relational. So we can generate the SQL, but then the way it's picked up and leveraged is specific depending on Spring Data JDBC is using Spring Framework's JDBC template under the hood, while the Spring Data R2DBC is using the R2DBC template under the hood. So it's some really cool stuff there.
Spring Data JDBC is really great. For the longest time, I would use Spring Data JDBC in my tutorials, but it would be a very simple version of it. There'd be one table, one model. So I'm modeling like a post. And finally, a couple months back, I really got the chance to dig into it. And I like how you said that. It's just a simpler version, because I think people forget, people who know JPA, it's very powerful. And you can do some really great things in it, but people forget the learning curve that comes with that power. And so I think Spring Data JDBC addresses some of that. I have a video on my YouTube channel. If you go ahead and check that out, youtube.com/, at Dan Vega with the new YouTube handles. I have a video on that I walk through that. Uh, Once you get kind of the base understanding of like aggregates, aggregate roots, domain driven design, I'm a big fan of Spring Data JDBC, and I use it a lot now. So if you're new, haven't checked it out, go ahead and check that out. This is my first time in the live, so I am happy to see you, Greg and Dan. Thanks, Oscar. Appreciate you joining us. Can we talk about aggregated queries with JPA? Most demos I see do simple CRUD operations. Think of an app that can serve data for a dashboard. I'm not sure I understand the question. So are you just talking about like more complex queries?
Well, I can
query
give
by
I can
example or aggregates.
I could throw out some stuff. Maybe it'll hit some of the points he's thinking of, because the idea of serving data to a dashboard app sounds like my job before I came to the Spring team for like 10 years, which was I had to provide an app to an ops team, and they had a dashboard to monitor a nationwide network 24/7. So in a sense, you have issues of, okay, can I go fetch all the data that needs to go on my dashboard in one bulk query or something like that? Or does it need to be contextual, where in the top quadrant, I'm fetching a kind of an upper level list, but if somebody clicks on an element, I need to go populate a secondary box based on that context. And so all this stuff is, at a certain level, this is relational database. This is relational data we're having to contend with here. So we need to query for data. And yes, the demos that we tend to give, we're trying to show the concept, so we don't go real deep on that kind of stuff. And it's almost like you have to go analyze your data, your specific database, to find out, if I run a single query, and I could spend 2 to 3 weeks optimizing a query, because you need to find out what the right indexes are. You need to communicate with the database team and their DBAs, and it's like, okay, how do I write the right query for this so that it's sub-second? So, maybe this dashboard needs to be showing a rolling window of 24 hours of data or something like that. So it needs to be refreshing itself. You can do all this stuff with like Spring Data JPA or Spring Data JDBC, or you can do it yourself with JDBC template if you are really looking for a beating. But the point is, you can go do that. You have to go design all the objects to connect together. You need to model it properly. And that's whether or not you're using JPA or JDBC. You just can't dodge modeling the structure. But we have queries that let you go fetch that. We can do the query derivation. A lot of times query derivation may satisfy the simpler queries. But if you need a more complex query, you can pivot to using the at query annotation. A lot of our data stores have an at query option where you can roll the query yourself. And a lot of times that's what you're doing when you need to, go write it yourself. Whether if you're using that can be whether or not you're writing a custom JPA query, or you can write what's called a native query, where you're really writing the SQL directly. And you're kind of sidestepping most of the entity manager and just letting Spring Data manage the connection for you. So these are all options you have to go fit that into it.
You could let the DBAs write this for you and just call a view, couldn't you?
Or you could let the DBAs do that. The point is to build that kind of dashboard. You really need to know what it's doing, because I also watched somebody at a previous job, not on the Spring team, but at a previous job, build a dashboard of an app, and the app, every time you updated the field, it took 20 minutes to save its changes, because this person was joining views with other views, which is a very bad maneuver. And I discovered after 3 weeks of analysis, he was joining the same table 20 times. So go call your DBAs and have a powwow meeting and sit there and try to bake a view that's right for you.
Or you could just write the SQL yourself, and then when it goes slow, you could use Spring Boot 3 and the new observability APIs to find out where it's going slow, right? Cool. I got some other comments here. I believe Spring JPA is an implementation of Spring Data JDBC. No.
There may be some confusion there. So we have we have Spring. So we have Spring Data as sort of an umbrella project. Spring Data JPA is a module that sits there and it talks directly to the entity manager on your behalf. And there's different avenues to it. Spring Data JPA has no JPA whatsoever inside of it. So it's instead like just it's instead analyzing the interface that you define, the repository that you define, and the entity objects that you've defined, not JPA entities, just plain old database entities. And it writes the queries and uses a JDBC template from Spring Framework under the hood to go talk to the database directly.
Cool.
Now, there's also a Spring JPA module, or there was a JPA template. The JPA template, Hibernate template. That was from long ago. There's a thing where you can talk directly to Hibernate. I think they later had a JPA template, but now it is recommended to, ever since it came out with the entity manager, to go talk through the entity manager's APIs. But and by the way, if you use Spring Data JPA, there's an entity manager in the app context. You can ask for it and talk to the entity manager on your own, but you're on your own.
Tread carefully. Cool. Thank you for that. Hello from Peru. We have a couple people in here from Peru today. Thanks for joining us. Hello. I don't want to butcher your name, so I'm not going to attempt it. Thank you for joining us. All right. I think I've gotten through kind of all of the news I wanted to get through. Did you want to talk a little bit about observability?
Well, yeah, I could give a sort of a crash course from somebody that's not directly on the observability team. So after this live stream, you need to go find one of Dan's previous sessions where he actually had Jonathan, who's on the observability team,
Yes.
to double check my homework here. But we got Brazil here in the chat too. Awesome.
All right.
So observability is this fundamental idea that, okay, I built the app, I put it in production. Where's all the time going? Where's all my, it's the database server is hitting 100% utilization every day at noon. What's happening that's making that happen? Okay. I've seen that in actual production systems where they suddenly were like, okay, get the lead engineers in here and figure out what's broken. So, ideally, this is something you do before the database hits 100% utilization, so you have a sense where the problems are. But it's idea of like, let's put some hooks in the code so I can tell how much time is being spent on a web call, how much time is being spent, actually running a query, collecting the results from the query. Maybe you're doing a remote call to a microservice or to another system. How much time is that taking? Where's all the time being spent through the system so you can go affect change, whatever that is? It's like, well, I don't know. The web layer seems to have a consistent fixed cost, but this one query is ridiculous in cost. So let's go. Then you can figure out who owns that query and go tell them to rewrite the query. And so the idea with observability is how, Spring, Rod Johnson's message back from the Spring One conference in 2008 was reducing Java complexity, and that message still holds to this day. So how can the Spring team simplify this process of go out and figure out where your time is being spent in production? And that's what the Spring observability team is doing.
Yeah, and as Jonathan taught us in a previous episode, the kind of three pillars of observability are logging, metrics, and distributed tracing. So generally, when we're talking about observability, those are the three things that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. Do you want me to add your screen here?
Yeah.
You want to show some things up?
I thought I would let's bring code. I mean, come on, who's going to come to office hours and not want to enjoy a coding session? So I actually have a couple here. This is a Spring Data JPA example. Now, we talked about complex queries a few minutes ago. This is not one of those. This is about as simple as it gets. And it's a little bit of a joke because what system needs a rewrite other than the payroll system, right? Okay. So I just have this real simple employee object here, and it's got three attributes. It's got the primary key, the name, and the role. So I'm going to track, who's on the team. And I've written I've got a little, wait a minute, I was trying to pull up the repository. So I have a repository here with our fun JPA repository using the list cred repository,
Nice.
which we kind of tackled. So, all you need to spec out is what's the domain object for this repository and the generic type for its primary key, which is a long. And then I have this arrest controller, which is we're just going to have this thing serialize some JSON for us. And the little fun constructor injection, we're just going to grab the employee repository. And then I've got a couple routes here mapped. One is call it /API employees, where let's find them all and serve them up here. Or maybe you want to find one. If you do a find by ID with Spring Data Commons, its default is to turn it optional. So the thing might not be there, the key that you're searching for. So you can alternatively throw, hey, person not found. Only it should be employee, right? Okay. So, and then I've got here, this is my Spring Boot application. Now this part, maybe if you've already been doing Spring Boot stuff, even before Spring Boot 3. This is Spring Boot 3, but this precedes it by a long shot. But down here, I load up some pre-baked data, and it's got some extra goodies here. But this is who's on my staff. I got Frodo the Ring Bearer and Bilbo the Burglar is part of my staff here. And it's wrapped in a callback. And this right here is micrometer through and through. So what we have here is with observability, we've already got, this team has gone in and already wrapped things like Spring MVC. So if you make a web call, it's already going to instrument it. Now it's going to sniff out whether or not you're actually linked up to a system, so it can fall through if there's actually nobody gathering metrics. But if there is somebody listening, they will gather the metrics. But something that can't be captured is if you're sort of outside of that call chain. And this is what's called a command line runner. So this creates a bean that when the app is up and running, Spring Boot says, okay, I'm ready, run all the command line runners as an afterthought. So it's going to run this code. So this code is going to make an observation. It's going to create it, not start it yet. It's going to give it a tactical name here. I just called it a NIT database for fun. And there's also a bean created by Spring Boot called an observation registry. This is a thing that's responsible for collecting observations. And then it's going to say, now observe this callback, okay? And this is where it's going to actually go try to talk to the database. Now, let's go ahead and just run the app here, and then we'll poke at it, see how it looks, and then I'll show you a little bit more on the back end that maybe we didn't see. So it's up and running. I'm going to let me clear this terminal screen here, but let's do a little curl. I like to run it through JQ, which is a JSON prettifier. But here's the output from my thing. I got my two entities here. It handed me back a JSON list basically with the two entities, and I can sit there and I can go curl for one of those if I type in the primary key. So I can go get Frodo back here. Now, I did all this. Let's flip to. I've got more than one thing open here, so I need to get the one that's on this shared on this desktop. Here we go. Okay. Oh, just a second. I need to drag this onto my shared screen. How about we do that? Okay, so here I've configured this for Zipkin. I'll show you how I did that in a moment, but Zipkin is running. I happen to have Docker Desktop on my machine, so it's running Zipkin through a Docker container. And if I sit there and hit this run query thing, it's going to, by default, I think, look at the last 10 or 15 minutes of tracing stuff. So right at the top here, I can see my init database action that we just talked about here. And if I click this button, it's going to show me everything that it just did. So this is when basically the observation started. You can see the span of this whole thing is here. But if I look at here at the point that it opened up a connection, I'm using H2 for an in-memory database. It created a connection, and it used the ever popular Hikari connection pool to do it. And here's where it actually ran the query, and you can even see what query it ran right here. It's actually getting nice. It's selecting from an employee sequence to get the key. And it got back one row. And then the next operation was, let's finally insert that into the employee table.
And I like how it's showing you each of for each kind of line there, like how long that took. So
Mm-hmm.
right out of the gate, if you were looking at this and anything was kind of alarming, you would get some heads up right away.
Yep. And you can click on this thing to either expand or whatever. This is this is what Zipkin does, and we have time. It's got like all kinds of timestamps, and it's a wealth of information shown here. We can see in this context the queries are really not eating up the time here, so
Mm-hmm.
this one's not doing too bad. But if I back out here, I can actually see where I did this query here. So I can see this. It was this at the top. Here's the method and the HP get /API /employees. Again, it get a connection to the database. Finally, run the query. Now remember, we're using JPA, so under the hood, JPA transformed that operation into a JDBC call. So this is the final JDBC query that was actually executed.
Nice.
And as always, it's hard to read. One of the reasons why people were really cheering at Jens's presentation in 2018 about Spring Data JDBC, because we always get questions, how can I tweak my JPA query to do this, that, and the other? And so we got back 2 rows of data.
So I think, we were talking before, and I think one of the things I want to point out here that may not be obvious to everyone else. In the one instance, in the command line runner, you used the observability API to add some stuff in there, right? But in the one instance, in the controller, you didn't. And so I think what I want to get out of that is just that there are metrics being collected behind the scenes from all the Spring Data stuff or all the data, the normal data interactions. So you don't need to go in and sprinkle in these, all of these observability APIs into every single transaction. That's happening already for you, correct?
Correct. So there's 2 key things, or like what I would describe as 2 key things that are happening here, is that we need to, what you don't need to do is you don't need to wrap the calls. We're doing that for you. And you don't have to do what's called context propagation. So there's a certain handoff that's being handled for you, where you're in the web layer. It's the Spring is starting the observation when the web call hits the dispatch or servlet or somewhere inside there. It's starting the observation, but then it is propagating the context along to the next layer and the next layer after that, and so on and so forth. And it's working whether or not you're using the imperative model with Spring MVC, or if you're using Reactor with Spring Webflux, for example.
Cool. Yeah, like I said, I kind of learned that in the last couple of weeks, and so I just thought we should point that out. So your code in the command line runner was just to show off that observability API.
Yeah, the reason I did that here is essentially boot, at least at this point. I'm sitting there clicking on the browser instead of the IDE. Boot right now is not coded to say observe everything that comes out of a command line runner. It
Right.
does not do that, because maybe we don't have
Gotcha.
sufficient grounds for that. But I think it's a pretty standard procedure to say we do want to instrument every web call coming through the dispatch or servlet through Spring MVC.
Yep.
So this is a scenario where let's wrap that, and it's not hard to do.
Yep.
I didn't have to go make this bean. It was made for me.
Yep.
Now the thing I did to actually enable that, if I go to the build file, I used Maven, but you can get the counterpart to it if you use Gradle with start.spring.io, everyone's favorite website. You have to add Spring Boot's actuator to your project. I think you mentioned that earlier. This is just data JPA and Spring MVC, but this is the module I added here, which is the data source micrometer Spring Boot module that will basically find when you bring this on board, it will find any data source being registered in the app context and wrap it with a proxy that will then log it through micrometer. And I added these. I had the micrometer bits here, and these are the these are the hooks to because I'm talking to Zipkin. But you can pick
Mhm.
one of the other things. I think start.spring.io has Prometheus, so you can pick Prometheus from the checklist, and I think it should fit your app just fine. You just then need to launch an instance of Prometheus, maybe using Docker Compose or something.
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, if you go over to micrometer.io, or at least on the GitHub site, there are some Spring Boot 3 samples. I know I've seen some examples of using Zipkin, Prometheus, Grafana. So if you want some examples of that, go check that out. And yeah, micrometer.io, there's a whole bunch of really great information here as well. So
Yeah, they list down at the bottom of the page, and they list a lot of the stuff. I mean, there's a lot of toolkits you can hook into,
yep.
and it's really a nice clean API to. It's sort of like SLF for J, but for tracing. I think I can't remember if I
Yep.
say it on here or not, but SLF is simple logging facades. I think I actually learned that just a week ago is what that stands for. So this is a tracing facade to hook into stuff.
Yep. There it is. Yep.
Absolutely.
And then so the big change here is that we are kind of deprecating Spring Cloud Sooth for the distributed tracing, and that kind of rolls right into Micrometer. Right?
That's right.
Cool. Awesome stuff. Yeah, like I said, I think people don't understand what you're getting out of the box. So more examples. We'll try and come up with more examples to show that off. But the two things that you'll want to probably want to know right away are, hey, what's going on with my database? What are all these find all or find one? How long are these taking? Are there any things that I should be worried about? And then in a web world, if I'm calling another service, what's happening there? And so those are being instrumented for you out of the box, and you can get insights into what's happening there right out of the box now, which is really great.
And a cool feature I found out about this is a setting that Spring Boot has for Micrometer is that I remember in one of the first systems I worked on in my career, they had this tracing system, and they were always the senior engineering was always deciding whether or not when to turn it on because it would flood the system with log messages. It would just bogs things down, and they were trying to decide what to trace or not trace. And they have this feature where by default it actually only traces one. The default is 0.1. This is a setting for basically 1 out of 10 actions is what actually gets traced. So for a demo, I wanted it to trace every call, because almost boring if it doesn't trace it. So you can actually go dial this in and say, maybe I need, maybe my system's so huge I can dial 1 out of 1,000 or something like that and still get a read on it without compromising the performance of the system or requiring that I double the number of instances I'm running in the cloud.
Right. Cool. All right, I got a question here. Do we get any default endpoints that we can use to scrape for those metrics? So I know in the actuator, there's that metrics endpoint. The metrics endpoint will show you all the metrics available. And then for some of the data stuff and the web stuff, there are individual metrics endpoints that you can hit. But I know, at least from the data and the web stuff, those are only going to give you a few metrics. If you want to get more visibility into that, you have to use something like Zipkin or Grafana to kind of get some insight into those metrics that are being collected.
And you may have to check the ref documents because I know once long ago, they kind of turned everything on when you added actuator, but there's actually risk in that from a security standpoint, and you want to expose everything. So I think they adjusted what was exposed by default versus what with a simple property setting, you specify what do you want to expose and how much. So I would go read the reference documents to figure out what they're exactly you're getting or not getting. I had another thought and then I lost it.
No problem. But yeah, if you're just playing around on your local machine, include all of the endpoints, go check out the metrics endpoint, see which metrics are there. And then you could go to local/8080/actuator/metrics and then the metrics name and see what information is being instrumented there.
Oh, I know what I was thinking of. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Go. No, no. Go ahead. We'll wait a second here.
There's another thing that's happening is there's this movement afoot called open telemetry, and it's again, I'm scrolling on the wrong page. This is a cloud native computing foundation. The CNCF is incubating this, and they've merged some stuff. And part of what they're doing here is essentially saying let's have a consistent set of tag names. So we recently made updates to pick up a kind of the idea is let's trace what we're going to trace, but let's pick a common vocabulary, a name for all these tag values that we're capturing, so that no matter who's logging it, independent tools could then come and look at Zipkin and parse the data out of that and maybe give you a bird's eye view or a better dashboard reading if we all use the same vocabulary for tracing the stats.
That's great. Can you imagine like somebody selling a shower curtain that only had 4 holes on it and then trying to hang that up, or a shower curtain that had 26 holes and then trying to hang that one up? We're very lucky that somebody has standardized that and put the same amount of holes on every shower curtain. So similar thing here. I really like that we're moving towards that.
Mm-hmm.
Another comment I got: spring support for an observation out of the box is an incredible feature which removes all the headaches about distributed tracing. So completely agree. We haven't even touched on the distributed tracing aspect yet. Again, I want to put some demos together on that. It's really great. Does it make sense integrating trace ID in the response header? I would, again, I have not gone through any of these demos myself. I'll have to put these together to see how that works. I think.
Well, I know part of what they do is they create spans.
Right.
And I know they basically, like, if you're making a remote web call, like if you're using REST template and you've got tracing enabled, essentially they're taking the span ID and they stick it in the request headers to send it over there, such that it's going to come back in the response headers, and they can sit there and then they can measure that. And so that's part of the magic of what they're doing. And so, that's already baked for you.
Right. So the span is like, hey, I'm going to call 3 different services and I want to like get some distributed tracing around all 3 of these calls. Right. So you start a span and you're saying, hey, for 1, 2, 3, 4, I'm going to call service A, then service B, then service C. And yeah, if you're using that same span ID across all 3 of those, that kind of collects those 3 together. So yeah, again, I have to work on some demos, but that part of it should be baked in. That's how that's how it kind of groups these things together. So,
and you can see that this is part of the stuff you talked about, logs, or like Jonathan had mentioned logs. And this is, what I've seen security audit systems are based on gobbling up log files. And they, this is the thing, they need these span IDs, if you will, just to track everything. And so it's doing it for you and handling it so that it makes this hierarchy stuff.
Cool. Dan, first, I would like to thank you for your videos. You're welcome. Can I ask you about how to prevent JWT from stooling during requests and responses illustrated by the coding? Not sure what you're asking there. Please hit me up on Twitter and let me know about that. Kind of off topic. We'll get to that though. Hit me up on Twitter and see if we can't get that answered for you. Off topic, is there a lightweight flow engine as part of Spring based on Spell, Spring integration, and Spring Cloud Flow are heavyweight for a use case? I do not have an answer for that. Do you know anything about that, Greg?
I don't know. The last time I've looked at like Spring Cloud Data Flow, I assume is what we were talking about. I didn't know if they were. I didn't realize they were heavyweight. To me, there was a Spring Cloud Data Flow is like really slick in my view because it raises the entire conversation up to inputs and outputs. And so instead of thinking about, I don't need to think about RabbitMQ, I don't need to think about template calls, I don't need to think about brokers. I just think about, I'm consuming this message and I'm transforming it, I'm publishing that message, and I'm driven by what's coming in and spitting out outputs, and it's about gluing the pipes together. And I think they even have a UI to do that visually. So cool. Glenn Renfro may be somebody you can ping on Twitter to see if he's got some more information about that. I don't know how much they do. I don't know how much all that works with Spell per se. Spell's kind of a really cool voodoo language you can pick up and run with to do stuff with, but I don't know how much Spell is in Spring Cloud Data Flow, for example.
Rule number
So I
one
didn't
in
know
the
that.
spring world: do not roll your own. I'm sure that something can handle that on a lightweight scale for you. Cool. All right. Do you have anything else you want to show off? If not, Greg, I'm gonna go ahead and wrap us up.
No, nope, I'm
Cool.
good.
All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for showing up today to Spring Office Hours. I want to thank my good friend Greg Turnquist for co-hosting with me today. Greg, if people want to find out a little bit more about you and what you're up to, where can we find that info?
Well, just check it out right here. Go to youtube.com/ at Spring Boot Learning, because I've gone and made videos too. I was inspired by Dan, so I went and started making my own videos. So go check it out and see if you can look at my DTO video and ding my presentation on not using DTOs, but instead putting entities in the web layer.
Cool. What else? You excited about? You're just excited about Spring Boot 3, Spring Framework 6?
I'm I'm excited. I'm excited for Spring Boot 3. That's cool stuff. We're landing a big plane, and I think it's coming in. It's coming in good. I'm also stoked for
Yeah.
stuff like next year. We've got Dev Nexus coming in April. Um, we got the virtual version of Spring One coming toward the end of January. So go check that out. It's going to be
Yep.
it's all freebie. So there's no reason not to dial up for that one. So
Yep. Yep. Cool. Well, Greg, I told you this before. I really appreciate you coming on and joining me on Spring Office Hours. It was kind of last minute. I appreciate you accommodating us. Good to have you on, and always good to catch up with you, my friend. Let's do it again real soon. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.